Nothing breaks a woman's heart quite like watching her husband's dreams slip through her fingers. Sarah Mitchell had promised him on his deathbed that she'd keep the ranch, but now the bank notice in her hands makes that promise feel like a cruel joke. The Wyoming Territory ranch that once filled their hearts with hope now drowns her in debt she can never repay. 30 days, that's all she has before losing everything. Then a stranger rides up to her gate. He's tall, well-dressed, with kind eyes, and a black hat pulled low. His horse is fine, his clothes expensive, but his manner is gentle. He dismounts and walks to her porch with the confidence of a man who knows what he wants. His offer is simple. He'll pay every debt, save her ranch, and ask for only one thing, in return her hand in marriage. But can a grieving widow trust a man who seems too good to be true? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Mitchell ranch, stretching from the weathered barn to the modest farmhouse where Sarah sat at her kitchen table, staring at the foreclosure notice for what felt like the 100th time. The paper trembled in her hands not from fear, but from exhaustion. She'd been fighting this battle for 8 months now, ever since Thomas passed, leaving her with nothing but memories and mounting bills. She twisted the thin gold band on her finger, Thomas's wedding ring catching the light. They'd married young, barely 20, full of dreams about building something lasting in this harsh but beautiful land. The ring was simple, just like Thomas had been honest, hard-working, devoted. He'd promised her they'd make it work, that the ranch would provide for them, and the children they'd hoped to have. But the children never came, and now Thomas was gone, buried beneath the old oak tree on the hill behind the house. "Mrs. Mitchell," the voice from her front porch made her jump. She'd been so lost in thought she hadn't heard the horse approach. Through the window, she could see a man's silhouette against the morning light. "Ma'am, I was wondering if I might have a word with you." Sarah rose slowly, smoothing her worn calico dress. She wasn't expecting visitors, especially not this early. Most folks in Sweet Creek knew better than to bother the grieving widow unless it was urgent. She opened the door cautiously, keeping the screen latched. The man standing on her porch was unlike anyone she'd seen in these parts. He was taller than Thomas had been, with broad shoulders that filled out his expensive-looking coat. His hat was black felt, not the practical leather most ranchers wore, and his boots were polished to a shine that seemed almost out of place in the dusty Wyoming Territory. But it was his eyes that struck her, most deep brown, kind, with the sort of patience that spoke of a man who'd learned to wait for what he wanted. "I'm Jonathan Wade, ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat respectfully. "I heard about your situation. I was hoping we might talk." Sarah's hand tightened on the door frame. Everyone in town knew about her situation by now. The banker, Mr. Plassant, Cornelius, had made sure of that when he'd started hinting that the Mitchell place would soon be available for purchase. Vultures, every one of them, circling while she struggled to keep her head above water. "If you're here about buying the ranch, Mr. Wade, I'm afraid you've wasted a trip. This land isn't for sale." "No, ma'am, I'm not here to buy anything." His voice was steady, respectful. "But I am here to help, if you'll let me." Something in his tone made her study his face more carefully. There was no pity there, no condescension, just genuine concern. Against her better judgment, she found herself unlatching the screen door. "I suppose you'd better come in then." The kitchen seemed smaller with Jonathan Wade in it. He removed his hat, revealing dark hair touched with silver at the temples, and accepted her offer of coffee with quiet gratitude. As she poured, Sarah found herself sneaking glances at him. He had the bearing of a successful man. Everything about him spoke of prosperity, from his well-tailored clothes to the gold watch chain, visible beneath his vest. What was a man like this doing on her failing ranch? "Mrs. Mitchell," he began once they were both seated, "I know this might sound presumptuous, but I've been asking around town about you." Sarah stiffened. "Oh, nothing improper, I assure you. Well, I was curious about your husband's ranch. About you." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. I understand you're facing some financial difficulties. Heat rose in Sarah's cheeks. The shame of it was almost unbearable, having her private troubles discussed by strangers. I don't see how that's any concern of yours, Mr. Wade. Perhaps it isn't, he admitted, but I'd like it to be. The words hung in the air between them. Sarah set down her coffee cup with shaking hands. I'm not sure I understand. Jonathan leaned forward slightly, his expression earnest. Mrs. Mitchell, Sarah, if I may, I'm a successful businessman. I own cattle ranches in Colorado and Montana, mining interests in Nevada, and property in San Francisco. I've been blessed with considerable wealth, but I've been cursed with considerable loneliness. Sarah's heart began to beat faster. She had a feeling she knew where this conversation was heading, and it frightened her more than the foreclosure notice had. I'm 42 years old, Jonathan continued. I've never married, never found the right woman, never had a family of my own. I've spent the last 20 years building an empire, but empires are cold comfort when you're eating dinner alone every night. Mr. Wade, please, let me finish. His voice was gentle but firm. I came to Sweet Creek on business looking into some mining claims north of here. But when I heard about you, about your situation, I saw an opportunity that might benefit us both. Sarah stood abruptly, walking to the window that overlooked Thomas's grave on the hill. You want to buy my ranch after all? No. The single word was quiet, but definitive. I want to marry you. The silence stretched between them like a taut rope. Sarah gripped the windowsill, her knuckles white. Outside, the wind moved through the grass around Thomas's grave, making it dance like wheat in a summer field. You don't even know me, she whispered. I know enough. Jonathan's voice was closer now. He'd risen from his chair. I know you're a woman of courage. You've been fighting to save this place for months when most people would have given up. I know you're loyal. You made a promise to your husband, and you're trying to keep it even though it's breaking you. I know you're proud enough that accepting charity would be harder for you than losing everything. Sarah turned to face him, tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. And what do you know about love, Mr. Wade? About what it means to share a life with someone? His expression grew sad, distant. I know what it's like to want it. I know what it's like to see other men with families, with wives who worry about them, and children who run to greet them when they come home. I know what it's like to have everything the world says should make a man happy, and still feel empty inside. So you thought you'd just buy yourself a wife? No. The word came out sharper than he'd intended, and he softened his tone. I thought I might offer a practical arrangement that could benefit us both. You need financial security. I need companionship. We could start there and see what develops. Sarah sank back into her chair, her mind reeling. It was insane, impossible. She barely knew this man, and he was proposing marriage as if it were a business transaction. But as she looked around her modest kitchen at the chipped crockery, the worn furniture, the stack of unpaid bills on the counter, she couldn't deny the desperate appeal of his offer. What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Wade? He sat back down, his movements careful and measured. I pay off all your debts. I provide funds to improve and maintain the ranch. In return, you become my wife. We live here together, and I help you run this place the way your husband would have wanted. And what do you expect from me, as your wife? A flush crept up Jonathan's neck. I expect nothing beyond your companionship and your presence. Anything else would have to develop naturally, between us, in its own time. I'm not asking you to love me, Sarah. I'm asking you to give us both a chance at something better than what we have now. Sarah stared at him, this strange gentleman who'd ridden into her life with an impossible offer. Part of her wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it all. Part of her wanted to cry with relief. And part of her, the part that had been drowning in loneliness and desperation for months, wanted to say yes before she could change her mind. I need time to think, she heard herself saying. Jonathan nodded. Of course, take all the time you need. He stood, placing his hat back on his head. I'm staying at the hotel in town for the next few days. When you've made your decision, you can find me there. He paused at the door, his hand on the frame. "Sarah, for what it's worth, I think your husband would want you to be happy. He wouldn't want you to lose everything he worked for just to preserve his memory. Sometimes honoring the dead means choosing to keep living." After he left, Sarah sat alone in her kitchen as the morning sun climbed higher, casting new shadows across the room. She looked at Thomas's ring on her finger, then at the foreclosure notice on the table, then out the window toward the grave on the hill. For the first time in months, she felt something other than despair stirring in her chest. It wasn't hope or not yet, but it wasn't despair either. It was possibility, strange and frightening, and utterly unexpected. The question was, did she have the courage to reach for it? 3 days passed before Sarah found the courage to walk into the Sweet Creek Hotel. 3 days of sleepless nights, of staring at the ceiling and weighing her impossible choices. 3 days of visiting Thomas's grave and asking questions that received no answers except the whisper of wind through grass. The hotel lobby was modest but clean, with a faded Persian rug and chairs that had seen better days. Mrs. Henderson, the proprietor, looked up from her ledger with barely concealed curiosity. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Mitchell. How can I help you?" "I'm looking for Mr. Wade, Jonathan Wade. I believe he's staying here." Mrs. Henderson's eyebrows rose slightly. In a town the size of Sweet Creek, news traveled fast, and Sarah was certain that half the residents already knew about the mysterious stranger's visit to her ranch. "Room 12, dear. Shall I send word up that you're here?" "Please." Sarah took a seat near the window, smoothing her best dresser blue cotton that Thomas had always said brought out her eyes. Her hands were trembling, and she clasped them tightly in her lap. In her reticule, she carried the marriage contract that Jonathan had left with her the previous afternoon, the legal document that would transform her from a desperate widow into a businessman's wife. The contract was surprisingly straightforward. Jonathan would pay all outstanding debts on the ranch, provide monthly funds for improvements and maintenance, and ensure Sarah's financial security for life. In return, she would marry him and maintain his household. There were clauses about mutual respect, about the arrangement being dissolved if either party proved unsuitable to the other, about property rights and inheritance. It read more like a business partnership than a marriage proposal, which perhaps made it easier to consider. "Mrs. Mitchell?" She looked up to find Jonathan descending the stairs, dressed in a dark suit that made him look every inch the successful businessman he claimed to be. His expression was carefully neutral, but she caught a flicker of hope in his eyes that made her chest tighten. "Mr. Wade." She rose, the contract clutched in her hands. "I've made my decision." He gestured toward a quiet corner of the lobby, away from Mrs. Henderson's interested gaze. They sat across from each other in worn velvet chairs, the weight of the moment settling between them like dust. "I'll accept your proposal," Sarah said quietly. The relief that crossed Jonathan's face was so profound, it made her wonder just how much this arrangement meant to him. "I'm honored, Sarah. I truly am. I have conditions." "Of course. Name them." She took a breath, steadying herself. "I want to be buried next to Thomas when my time comes, on the hill behind the house. That ground must never be sold or developed." "Agreed. I want to keep running the ranch operations myself. You can advise, you can help, but the day-to-day decisions remain mine." "Understood. And I want your word that if this arrangement doesn't work, if we find we can't live together peaceably, you'll provide me with enough money to start over somewhere else. I won't be left destitute again." Jonathan leaned forward, his expression earnest. "Sarah, you'll never be destitute. Whether this marriage works or not, I'll see to that. You have my word." She studied his face, searching for any sign of deception or calculation. Instead, she found only sincerity and something that might have been loneliness, recognizing itself in another person. "Then I suppose we should make this official." They rode to the courthouse together, in Jonathan's well-appointed buggy, drawing stares from the townspeople they passed. Sarah felt their curious gazes like physical weight, imagining the conversations that would follow in their wake. The widow Mitchell, marrying a stranger for his money. How the mighty had fallen. Judge Morrison performed the ceremony in his chambers, with Mrs. Henderson and the court clerk serving as witnesses. The proceedings were brief, businesslike, a stark contrast to Sarah's first wedding, which had been held in the little church with half the town in attendance, flowers everywhere, and Thomas grinning like he'd won the lottery. When Judge Morrison pronounced them husband and wife, Jonathan leaned down to kiss her cheek, a chaste, respectful gesture that somehow made the reality of what they'd done sink in. She was married again. To a stranger. For money. "Well," Jonathan said as they signed the marriage certificate, "I suppose that makes it official." The ride back to the ranch, their ranch now, was quiet. Sarah found herself stealing glances at the man beside her, this person who was now legally her husband. His hands on the reins were steady, capable, with calluses that spoke of work, despite his obvious wealth. Whatever his business ventures, he wasn't a man who avoided physical labor. "About the sleeping arrangements," she said suddenly, then felt her cheeks flame. "I'll take the spare room," Jonathan said gently. "I saw it when I was here before. It'll suit me fine." Relief flooded through her. "Thank you, Sarah." He pulled the buggy to a stop in front of the house and turned to face her. "I meant what I said. This arrangement moves at whatever pace feels right to you. I'm a patient man." That evening, they sat across from each other at the kitchen table like polite strangers, which Sarah supposed they were. Jonathan had insisted on cooking, apparently. He'd learned the skill during his bachelor years, and the meal was surprisingly good. Simple but well prepared, like the man himself. "Tell me about your business interests," Sarah said, making an effort at conversation. "Cattle, mostly. Some mining. A few investments in railroad expansion." He cut his beef with methodical precision. "Nothing too exciting. What about the ranch here? What were you and Thomas raising?" "Cattle as well. Small herd, maybe 100 head at our best. Thomas always said we'd expand once we got established, but..." She trailed off, not wanting to speak of their struggles. "But it takes capital to expand, and capital was always needed elsewhere." She nodded, grateful that he understood without her having to explain. "The bank was patient at first, after Thomas passed. Mr. Cornelius said they'd work with me. But patience has its limits." "Not anymore," Jonathan said firmly. "Tomorrow we'll ride into town and settle every debt. After that, we'll make plans for improvements." Sarah looked across the table at this man, her husband, and felt a strange mixture of gratitude and unease. It seemed almost too easy, too good to be true. In her experience, when something seemed too good to be true, it usually was. "Jonathan," she said carefully, "why me? Truly. You could have your pick of women, younger women, prettier women, women without all this baggage." He set down his fork and considered her question seriously. "Do you want the honest truth?" "Please. Because when I asked around town about you, everyone said the same thing. They said you were decent, hard-working, and loyal to a fault. They said you'd been a good wife to Thomas and that you were breaking your heart, trying to honor his memory." He paused, his eyes finding hers across the table. "And because when I saw you that first morning, standing on your porch with your chin up despite everything you were facing, I thought to myself, there's a woman worth knowing." Sarah felt something flutter in her chestnut love. Not yet, but perhaps the beginning of respect. "And you? What should I know about you besides your business ventures?" Jonathan's expression grew more guarded. "I'm a simple man, despite appearances. I work hard, I keep my word, and I believe in treating people fairly. I've made mistakes, who hasn't? But I try to learn from them." "That's not really an answer." "It's the only answer I can give you right now." His voice was gentle but firm. "We both have pasts, Sarah. Yours is full of love and loss. Mine is more complicated. But I promise you this, nothing in my past will bring harm to you or to this ranch." She wanted to press him, to demand the whole truth, but something in his eyes stopped her. They all had their secrets, their private griefs. Perhaps some things were better revealed in their own time. After dinner, they sat on the front porch as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. It was peaceful, domestic in a way that felt both foreign and familiar. Jonathan proved to be a comfortable companion, content with silence when conversation lagged, offering observations about the land and the weather that showed he understood ranch life better than his expensive clothes might suggest. When the stars began to appear, they retired to their separate rooms. Sarah lay in the bed she'd shared with Thomas, staring at the ceiling and listening to the unfamiliar sounds of another person moving around her house. Down the hall, she could hear Jonathan's quiet footsteps, the creak of the floorboards, the soft thud of boots being removed. She was a married woman again, bound to a stranger by legal contract and desperate necessity. The thought should have terrified her, but instead, she found herself feeling something she hadn't experienced in months: security. Tomorrow, her debts would be paid. The ranch would be safe. She would have help with the endless work of keeping the place running. It wasn't love, but it was hope. And for now, that was enough. The first week of marriage felt like learning to dance with a partner whose steps you'd never practiced. Sarah and Jonathan moved around each other carefully, politely, each trying to find their place in this new arrangement without stepping on the other's toes. True to his word, Jonathan had ridden into town the morning after their wedding and settled every outstanding debt. The look of shock on banker Cornelius's face when Jonathan had counted out the full amount in cash was worth the months of worry Sarah had endured. Word spread quickly through Sweet Creek, and by afternoon, half the town seemed to have business that required them to ride past the Mitchell ranch, hoping to catch a glimpse of the mysterious wealthy husband. "Let them look," Jonathan had said mildly when Sarah mentioned the increased traffic. "Small towns thrive on gossip. We'll give them something harmless to talk about." But the attention made Sarah uncomfortable. She'd grown used to being pitied, even ignored, but this new scrutiny felt different. She was no longer the tragic widow struggling to survive. She was the woman who'd married for money, and that carried its own particular judgment. Jonathan seemed oblivious to the whispers, or perhaps he simply didn't care. He'd taken to studying the ranch with the methodical attention of a man evaluating an investment, walking the property lines, examining the condition of the fences, counting the cattle with practiced efficiency. He carried a small leather journal, bound in rich brown leather with brass corners, where he recorded his observations in neat, precise handwriting. Sarah found herself curious about that journal, though she was too proud to ask about its contents. She'd catch glimpses of him writing in it during the evenings, his dark head bent over the pages by lamplight, occasionally pausing to consider his words before continuing. There was something almost ritualistic about the way he cared for it, always placing it in the same spot on the kitchen table, always writing with the same careful deliberation. "The north pasture needs new fencing," he announced over breakfast one morning, "and the barn roof has some loose boards that should be replaced before winter." Sarah bristled slightly. "I know what needs fixing, Jonathan. I've been managing this place for months." I didn't mean to imply otherwise. His tone was even unruffled by her defensive response. "I was simply offering to arrange for the work to be done. I can arrange it myself." "Of course you can. But why should you have to?" It was a reasonable question, but it touched on something Sarah wasn't ready to examine too closely. Independence had been her lifeline during the dark months after Thomas's death. The idea of surrendering that independence, even partially, felt dangerous. Jonathan seemed to understand her struggle without her having to explain it. "What if we compromise?" he suggested. "You make the decisions about what needs to be done and when. I'll provide the means to do it." The arrangement worked better than Sarah had expected. She hired Jake Morrison, the judge's nephew, to repair the barn roof, and sent word to Pete Hartley about the fencing work. Both men were local, reliable, and in need of steady employment. Having the resources to pay fair wages for good work felt almost luxurious after months of trying to patch things together herself. Jonathan proved to be surprisingly useful around the ranch. Despite his refined appearance, he knew his way around cattle and wasn't afraid of physical work. Sarah watched from the kitchen window one morning as he helped Jake with the roofing, his expensive coat discarded in favor of work clothes that looked far more natural on him. He moved with easy competence, his hands sure and capable as he hammered shingles into place. "Your husband's quite the worker," Jake commented to Sarah when she brought them water at midday. "Don't see many businessman types who ain't afraid to get their hands dirty." "No," Sarah agreed, though she realized she still knew very little about where Jonathan had acquired such skills. His past remained largely a mystery, revealed only in small glimpses: the calluses on his hands, his knowledge of cattle, the way he examined the ranch infrastructure with the eye of someone who understood the practical realities of working the land. That evening, as they sat reviewing the day's progress, Sarah decided to risk a more personal question. "You seem to know a lot about ranching for a man who owns mining interests." Jonathan looked up from his journal, his pen poised over the page. "I started with cattle. Everything else came later." "Where?" "Texas, originally. Then Colorado." He returned to his writing, signaling that the subject was closed. Sarah felt a familiar frustration. It was like living with a man-shaped puzzle, only getting one piece at a time. But she was learning that direct pressure didn't work with Jonathan Wade. He revealed himself only when he chose to, in his own time and manner. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. Sarah had been struggling with a stubborn heifer that had gotten tangled in some old wire near the creek. The animal was panicked, thrashing against the metal that cut deeper with each movement. Sarah was trying to calm her while working the wire free when Jonathan appeared beside her. "Easy there, girl," he murmured to the heifer, his voice low and soothing. "Let's get you out of this mess." His hands moved with practiced efficiency, untangling the wire while keeping the animal calm with a steady stream of gentle words. Within minutes, the heifer was free, trotting away with nothing worse than superficial scratches. "Where did you learn to do that?" Sarah asked, impressed despite herself. Jonathan was examining a cut on his hand where the wire had caught him. "My father's ranch in Texas. I spent more time with the cattle than I did in the house growing up." "What happened to the ranch?" His expression darkened. "Sold it. After my father died, I had no reason to stay." There was pain in those words, old and carefully contained. Sarah recognized it because she carried similar wounds: the ache of loss, the guilt of moving forward, the complicated grief of surviving when someone you loved couldn't. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. Jonathan looked at her then, really looked at her, and for a moment the careful barriers he maintained seemed to thin. "It was a long time ago, but thank you." They walked back to the house together in comfortable silence, and Sarah realized something had shifted between them. It was subtle, perhaps only visible to someone who'd been watching for it, but the formal politeness that had characterized their early interactions was beginning to soften into something more genuine. That night, as she prepared for bed, Sarah found herself thinking about the way Jonathan had handled the frightened heifer, not with force or impatience, but with steady gentleness that gradually earned the animal's trust. She wondered if he was applying the same approach to her, waiting for her to stop seeing him as a threat and start seeing him as an ally. The thought was both comforting and unsettling. Comfort was dangerous. It made you vulnerable, made you forget to guard your heart against disappointment. But as Sarah listened to the familiar sounds of Jonathan moving around in the room down the hall, she had to admit that the careful distance they'd maintained was beginning to feel more like a barrier than a protection. Change was coming, whether she was ready for it or not. The question was whether she would fight it or find the courage to meet it halfway. The emotional breakthrough came on a morning when autumn had begun to paint the hillsides in shades of gold and crimson. Sarah was making her weekly visit to Thomas's grave, carrying fresh wildflowers she'd gathered from the meadow below the house. It was a ritual she'd maintained religiously since his burial, a way of keeping her promise that he wouldn't be forgotten. She knelt beside the simple wooden cross that marked his resting place, replacing the wilted flowers from the previous week with new ones. The cross was weathered now, the letters of his name beginning to fade from exposure to wind and rain. Soon it would need to be replaced or restored, another task she'd been putting off because it felt too final, too much like accepting that he was truly gone. "I married him, Thomas," she whispered to the grave, as if her late husband might somehow hear and understand. "The man I told you about, Jonathan Wade. I know it seems sudden, and I know you'd have questions, but I think you'd like him. He's good to me, patient. He saved the ranch, just like I promised you I would." The wind stirred the grass around the grave, and Sarah imagined she could hear forgiveness in its whisper. She'd been carrying guilt about the marriage for weeks now, feeling as though she was betraying Thomas's memory by allowing another man into their home, into their life. But sitting here in the morning sunlight, she found herself remembering something Thomas had said during his final illness. "Promise me you won't spend your life mourning, Sarah," he'd whispered, his voice weak but insistent. "Promise me you'll find a way to be happy again." She'd promised because it was what he needed to hear, but she'd never really believed she'd want happiness again. The grief had been so complete, so overwhelming, that the idea of feeling anything else seemed impossible. Now, though, she was beginning to recognize small stirrings of something that wasn't quite contentment, but wasn't despair either. "Mrs. Wade," Sarah started, turning to find Jonathan standing a respectful distance away. He was holding his hat in his hands, his expression uncertain, as if he wasn't sure whether he should retreat or approach. "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't mean to intrude. I was checking the fence line and saw you up here." "It's all right." Sarah rose, brushing dirt from her skirts. "I was just visiting with Thomas." Jonathan's gaze moved to the weathered cross, and she saw something shift in his expression, not judgment or impatience, but understanding. "I used to do the same thing. After my father died, I'd go out to his favorite spot on the range and just talk to him. Did it help? For a while, until I realized I was talking to myself more than to him." Jonathan stepped closer, his voice gentle. "The cross is getting weathered. Would you like me to make a proper headstone? Something more permanent?" The offer touched something deep in Sarah's chest. "You'd do that?" "Of course. Thomas was your husband. He deserves to be remembered properly." Sarah looked at the fading cross, then at Jonathan's earnest face. "He made that cross himself," she said quietly. "When we first moved here, before we had money for a proper churchyard burial, he said if something happened to him, he wanted to be buried on the land we were building together. Then we'll preserve it, incorporate it into the new headstone somehow." The thoughtfulness of the gesture, not replacing Thomas's handiwork, but honoring it, brought tears to Sarah's eyes. She turned away, embarrassed by the sudden emotion, but Jonathan's hand appeared gently on her shoulder. "Sarah," his voice was soft, careful, "you don't have to apologize for loving him. You don't have to pretend he didn't exist to make room for me in your life. I understand that he'll always be part of who you are." She turned to face him, studying his expression for any sign of resentment or calculation. Instead, she found only sincerity and something that looked remarkably like compassion. "How can you be so understanding about it?" she asked. "Most men would be jealous of a dead husband." Jonathan was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving across the landscape spread out below them. "Because I hope that someday, if something happens to me, you'll remember me with the same devotion. Love like that, real love, it's rare. It should be honored, not resented." The words hung between them in the crisp morning air, and Sarah felt something fundamental shift inside her. This man, this stranger who'd become her husband, was offering her something she hadn't expected permission to grieve fully while still moving forward, space to honor her past while building a future. "You're not what I expected," she admitted. "What did you expect?" "Someone more. Calculating, I suppose. Someone who saw me as property he'd purchased rather than a person he'd partnered with." Jonathan's laugh was rueful. "I can see how you might think that. The arrangement between us does sound rather businesslike when you put it plainly. Doesn't it bother you that I married you for your money rather than your charm? Doesn't it bother you that I married you for companionship rather than passion?" They looked at each other for a moment, and then Sarah found herself smiling, really smiling, for the first time in months. I suppose we're both guilty of practical motivations. Practical motivations can lead to good things in time. Some of the strongest marriages I've known started with far less than we have. And what do we have exactly? Jonathan considered the question seriously. Mutual respect, I think. Similar values. Compatible goals. He paused, his eyes meeting hers. And if I'm not mistaken, the beginning of genuine affection. Sarah felt her cheeks warm. He wasn't wrong somewhere over the past few weeks. Her wariness of him had begun to soften into something warmer. She looked forward to their evening conversations, found herself listening for his footsteps on the porch, noticed when he was away from the ranch longer than expected. "Perhaps you're right," she said softly. They walked back down the hill together, and Sarah was surprised to realize she felt lighter somehow, as if a burden she'd been carrying without realizing it had been lifted from her shoulders. The guilt about moving forward, about allowing another man into her life, seemed less crushing now. Thomas would have wanted her to be happy, and Jonathan was offering her a path towards something that might eventually become happiness. That afternoon, while Jonathan was in town arranging for materials to build the new headstone, Sarah found herself drawn to the spare room where he slept. She'd avoided it since their marriage, respecting his privacy, but curiosity finally overcame her restraint. The room was neat, almost Spartanly so. His few personal belongings were arranged with military precision clothes hung carefully in the wardrobe. Toiletries arranged, just so, on the washstand. But it was the small leather journal on the bedside table that caught her attention, the same one she'd seen him writing in each evening. She shouldn't look. She knew that. But her hand seemed to move of its own accord, opening the journal to a random page. The handwriting was Jonathan's careful script, but instead of business notes or ranch observations, she found herself reading something far more personal. Day 12. Sarah visited Thomas's grave again this morning. I find myself admiring her loyalty, even as I wish some small portion of it might eventually extend to me. She's stronger than she knows, braver than she gives herself credit for. I see her watching me sometimes, trying to solve the puzzle of who I am and why I'm here. If only I could tell her the whole truth. Sarah closed the journal quickly, her heart racing. She shouldn't have read it, shouldn't have invaded his privacy, but the glimpse into his thoughts left her shaken. He was thinking about her, wondering about her feelings, hoping for more between them than their practical arrangement had promised. When he returned from town that evening, she found herself studying his face differently, looking for signs of the deeper emotions she'd glimpsed in his writing. He seemed unaware of her scrutiny, sharing news of his day with his usual calm demeanor. "I spoke with the stonemason," he said over dinner. "He can have the headstone ready within the week." I described what we discussed, incorporating Thomas's cross into the design. He thinks it's a fine idea. "Thank you," Sarah said, meaning it deeply. "That's very thoughtful. It's the right thing to do." They were quiet for a moment, and then Sarah found herself asking the question that had been nagging at her since reading his journal. "Jonathan, what is it you're not telling me?" He looked up sharply, his fork halfway to his mouth. "I'm sorry? About your past. About why you're really here. There are pieces missing from your story, and I can't help but wonder what they are." Jonathan set down his fork carefully, his expression becoming guarded. "What makes you think there are missing pieces?" "Because no man becomes as successful as you claim to be without making enemies along the way. Because you're too comfortable with ranch work to have spent your whole career in business. Because sometimes I catch you looking over your shoulder as if you're expecting trouble to find you." The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken truths. Finally, Jonathan spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "You're right. There are things I haven't told you, but I'm not ready to share them yet, and I hope you can respect that. I will say this: nothing in my past poses any danger to you or to this ranch. That's a promise." Sarah wanted to push, to demand the whole truth, but something in his eyes stopped her. Everyone had their secrets, their private pain. She'd learned that lesson well enough in her own life. "All right," she said finally. "But Jonathan, when you are ready to tell me, I'll be here to listen." The gratitude in his expression was unmistakable. "Thank you, Sarah. That means more to me than you know." Later that night, as she lay in bed listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling around them, Sarah found herself thinking about trust. It came in different forms, sometimes all at once, like falling off a cliff, and sometimes gradually, like water wearing away stone. What she was feeling for Jonathan was the gradual kind, built on small kindnesses and daily reliability, rather than grand gestures or passionate declarations. It wasn't what she'd had with Thomas, but perhaps that was as it should be. Thomas had been her first love, her youth, her dreams of what life could be. Jonathan was something different, steadier, more complex, offering security and companionship rather than wild romance. But as she drifted towards sleep, Sarah found herself wondering if security and companionship might eventually grow into something deeper. The thought no longer frightened her as much as it once had. In fact, it almost felt like hope. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late October, delivered by a rider who looked like he'd traveled hard to get there. Sarah was hanging laundry when she saw the dust cloud on the horizon, and something about the urgency of the approaching horse made her stomach clench with unease. Jonathan emerged from the barn, where he'd been checking on a sick calf, his expression alert. The rider dismounted without ceremony, his face grim beneath the brim of his hat. "You Jonathan Wade?" he asked, his voice rough from the trail. "I am." The man handed over a sealed envelope, official-looking and thick. "From Denver. The man who sent me said it was urgent." Jonathan's face went carefully blank as he accepted the letter, but Sarah caught the slight tension in his shoulders. He tipped the messenger generously and sent him toward the house for food and rest before his return journey. "Business trouble?" Sarah asked, trying to keep her voice casual. "Possibly." Jonathan turned the envelope over in his hands, studying the wax seal. "I need to read this privately, if you don't mind." The dismissal stung, even though Sarah understood it was his right to handle his affairs as he saw fit. She nodded and returned to hanging clothes, but her attention remained fixed on Jonathan as he walked toward the house, the letter clutched in his hand like a weapon. An hour passed before he emerged, his face set in lines she'd never seen before. The easy confidence that usually characterized his movements was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like resignation. "Sarah," he called to her from the porch, "could you come inside? We need to talk." Her hands stilled on the sheet she was pinning to the line. Those words, "we need to talk," never preceded good news. She followed him into the kitchen, where he was standing by the window, staring out at the mountains with unseeing eyes. "What is it?" she asked. Jonathan turned to face her, and she was startled to see genuine anguish in his expression. "I have to leave for Denver. Tomorrow." "For how long?" "I don't know. Possibly. Possibly for good." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She sank into a chair, her mind racing. "What's happened?" Jonathan sat across from her, the opened letter on the table between them. "There are complications with some of my business interests. Legal complications. I may need to liquidate assets, settle debts, possibly face charges." "What kind of charges?" He was quiet for so long, Sarah thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Fraud, embezzlement, activities that allegedly took place before I came here." "Allegedly?" "The charges aren't true, Sarah, but proving that may be difficult." Sarah stared at him, trying to reconcile this news with the man she'd come to know. The Jonathan Wade who'd gently freed the heifer from the wire, who'd offered to preserve Thomas's cross in the new headstone, who wrote thoughtful observations in his leather journal each night that man didn't seem capable of the crimes being described. "Tell me what really happened," she said firmly. Jonathan's laugh was bitter. "What makes you think I'd tell you the truth now, when I've kept it from you all this time?" "Because I'm your wife. Because I deserve to know what I'm facing." He studied her face for a long moment, then seemed to come to some internal decision. "All right, but once I tell you, you'll understand why I may have to leave and never come back." Sarah's heart clenched, but she kept her voice steady. "I'm listening." Jonathan rose and began pacing, as if movement might make the telling easier. I wasn't entirely honest about my business background. Yes, I own cattle ranches and mining interests, but I acquired them through unconventional means. What kind of unconventional means? I worked for the railroad companies initially, then for certain businessmen who needed problems solved quietly. Men who'd been cheated out of land deals, swindled by partners, abandoned by investors who left them holding worthless paper. Sarah felt a chill creep up her spine. What kind of work did you do for them? I recovered what was stolen. I made sure cheaters faced consequences. I ensured that justice was served when the law couldn't or wouldn't act. He stopped pacing and met her eyes. I suppose you could call me a hired gun, though I preferred to think of myself as someone who leveled the playing field. The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a gun barrel. Sarah tried to process what he was telling her, that the quiet, thoughtful man she'd married was some kind of vigilante, someone who operated outside the law to settle scores for wealthy clients. You killed people, she said, and it wasn't a question. Sometimes, when they couldn't be reasoned with, when they posed a continued threat to innocent people, when there was no other way to stop them. His voice was matter-of-fact, but she could see the weight of those decisions in his eyes. I never killed anyone who didn't deserve it, Sarah, but I won't lie to you, there was blood on my hands when I came here. Sarah's mind reeled. Everything she thought she knew about Jonathan Wade was crumbling, replaced by an image of a man who'd lived by violence, who'd made his fortune through methods that existed in the shadows between legal and illegal. And now someone's coming after you for it? The letter is from my former employer, Marcus Beaumont. He's been arrested on charges of conspiracy and fraud related to some land deals in Colorado. Apparently, he's trying to reduce his sentence by providing information about his associates, including you. Including me? Jonathan sat back down, his shoulders sagging. He knows enough to cause serious trouble, and he has documentation that could implicate me in activities that, while morally justified, were not strictly legal. Sarah stared at the letter on the table, this piece of paper that threatened to destroy the fragile life they'd been building together. What will you do? I'll go to Denver and try to contain the damage. Meet with lawyers, see if there's a way to discredit Beaumont's testimony or negotiate some kind of arrangement. He looked up at her, his expression haunted. But Sarah, you need to understand, if I can't resolve this, I'll have to disappear. Permanently. I won't bring federal marshals to your door or put you in danger because of my past. And what about me? What about our marriage? You'd be free to divorce me for abandonment. The ranch is in your name now. I made sure of that when I settled your debts. You'd be financially secure, able to rebuild your life however you chose. The practical arrangements laid out so calmly while her world collapsed around her. Sarah wanted to scream at him, to rage against his deception, to demand to know what else he'd hidden from her. Instead, she found herself asking the one question that mattered most. Did you ever care about me at all, or was I just a convenient place to hide while you figured out your next move? The pain that flashed across Jonathan's face was answer enough, but he spoke anyway. I came here to disappear. That's true. I'd heard about the widow who needed help, and it seemed like perfect cover, a remote ranch, a woman who wouldn't ask too many questions, a chance to live quietly while things cooled down. Sarah's heart clenched. But I didn't expect you, he continued, his voice rough with emotion. I didn't expect to find someone worth staying for, worth fighting for. I didn't expect to fall in love. The words should have brought joy, but instead they felt like a knife twisting in her chest. Love built on lies isn't love at all, Jonathan. No, he agreed quietly. I suppose it isn't. They sat in silence as the afternoon light faded around them, two people who'd found something precious only to discover it might be built on sand. Outside, the messenger's horse nickered softly in the corral, waiting to carry Jonathan away from the only place he'd ever felt like he could build a real life. Tomorrow, he would leave for Denver and an uncertain future. Tonight, they would sleep in the same house as strangers once again, the tentative trust they'd built crumbling like autumn leaves in the wind. Jonathan left before dawn, his saddlebags packed with the essentials of a man who might not be coming back. Sarah watched from the kitchen window as he secured his bedroll to his horse, his movements efficient and practiced the actions of someone who'd fled before, who knew how to travel light and fast when necessity demanded it. She'd barely slept, tormented by the revelation of who her husband really was and what it might mean for her future. The man she'd begun to trust, to care for, was a stranger whose past was filled with violence and deception. Yet as she watched him prepare to leave, all she could think about was the gentleness in his hands when he'd freed the frightened heifer, the thoughtfulness of his offer to preserve Thomas's cross. Which man was real, the hired gun or the patient rancher? Perhaps they both were, and that was what frightened her most. Jonathan appeared at the kitchen door, hat in hand, his expression carefully composed. "I wanted to say goodbye properly." Sarah turned from the window, noting the way the early morning light caught the silver in his hair, the lines around his eyes that spoke of hard decisions and harder consequences. "How long do you think you'll be gone?" "I honestly don't know. If things go well, perhaps a few weeks. If they don't..." He shrugged, the gesture eloquent in its resignation. "And if they don't go well, what happens to me?" "You'll be fine, Sarah. Better than fine. You're stronger than you know." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to something intimate and urgent. "There's money in the Denver bank, more than enough to keep the ranch running for years. The account information is in my desk drawer, along with legal papers that transfer everything to you if something happens to me. You've thought of everything." "I've tried to. I owe you that much." Sarah wanted to be angry with him, to rage against his deceptions and the way he was abandoning her just as she'd begun to trust him. Instead, she found herself memorizing his face, storing away the details in case this was the last time she'd see him. "Jonathan," she said quietly, "what you told me yesterday about caring for me, about falling in love, was any of that true?" His mask slipped then, revealing the vulnerability beneath. "Every word. Whatever else I've lied about, that was real." Before she could respond, he was gone, riding hard toward the eastern horizon where Denver lay waiting. Sarah stood at the window until he disappeared from sight, then sat down at the kitchen table and allowed herself to cry for the man she was losing, for the trust that had been broken, for the uncertain future that stretched ahead of her like an unmarked trail. The days that followed passed in a strange suspension of normalcy. Sarah maintained the ranch, routines feeding the cattle, checking the fences, managing the small tasks that kept the place running. But everything felt hollow, temporary, as if she were merely keeping house in someone else's life until the real owners returned. The townspeople, of course, noticed Jonathan's absence. Mrs. Henderson from the hotel made a point of visiting after a week, ostensibly to check on Sarah's welfare, but clearly fishing for information about her mysterious husband's sudden departure. "Business in Denver, I heard," Mrs. Henderson said over tea, her eyes bright with curiosity. "Must be important to take him away so suddenly." "Yes," Sarah replied noncommittally. "Business matters. Such a shame, leaving you alone so soon after the wedding. Though I suppose you're used to managing on your own by now." The comment stung. Even though Sarah knew it wasn't meant maliciously, she was indeed used to managing alone, had been doing it since Thomas's death. But she'd grown accustomed to Jonathan's presence, to the comfort of shared meals and evening conversations, to the security of knowing someone else cared about the ranch's welfare. After Mrs. Henderson left, Sarah found herself drawn to Jonathan's room. She'd avoided it since his departure, but loneliness finally overcame her reluctance. The space still smelled faintly of his cologne, and his few remaining belongings seemed to wait patiently for his return. The leather journal was gone, he'd taken it with him to Denver. But in the drawer of the small desk by the window, Sarah found the papers he'd mentioned: bank documents, property transfers, legal arrangements that painted a picture of a man who'd planned for every contingency except the possibility of happiness. There was also a letter, sealed and addressed to her in his careful handwriting. Her hands trembled as she opened it, unsure whether she wanted to read what might be his final words to her. "My dear Sarah," it began, "if you are reading this, then I have not returned from Denver, and you are facing the future I hope to spare you from contemplating. Please know that my feelings for you were genuine, even if everything else about me was built on deception. I came to your ranch as a man running from his past, seeking nothing more than a safe place to hide. I leave it as a man who has learned what it means to have something worth fighting for. You taught me that, though I doubt you realize it. You have strength enough to build whatever life you choose. Don't let my failures limit your possibilities. The money I've left will ensure you never face the desperation that brought us together, but more importantly, you have the courage and determination to succeed at whatever you attempt. If circumstances had been different, if I had been a better man with a cleaner past, I would have stayed and spent my life trying to earn the love I saw beginning to grow between us. As it is, I can only hope that someday you'll remember me with some small measure of kindness. All my love, Jonathan." Sarah read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and placed it back in the drawer. Outside, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, promising the kind of autumn weather that could keep a person indoors for days. The approaching isolation felt appropriate somehow. She needed time to think, to process what she'd learned about the man she'd married and what it meant for her future. 3 weeks passed, with no word from Denver. Sarah threw herself into ranch work, preparing for winter with the methodical determination of someone who had no choice but to persevere. She hired additional help for the heaviest tasks, using Jonathan's money without guilt. If he'd wanted to provide for her, she'd let him, whatever his reasons had been. But late at night, when the work was done and the house was quiet, she found herself listening for the sound of approaching hoofbeats, hoping against reason that Jonathan would return with explanations that made sense of everything, with assurances that they could build a future despite his complicated past. The hoofbeats, when they finally came, arrived at sunset on a cold November evening. But the riders who approached her ranch weren't Jonathan returning triumphant from Denver. They were strangers, 3 men in dark coats who sat their horses with the easy confidence of people accustomed to getting their way through intimidation. Sarah watched them from her kitchen window, her heart sinking as she recognized the type, if not the individuals. These were the kind of men Jonathan had warned her about, the ones who might come looking for him if his past caught up with their present. The question was, what did they want, and how far were they willing to go to get it? The 3 men dismounted with deliberate slowness, their movements calculated to project menace. Sarah remained at the kitchen window, her hand instinctively moving to the shotgun Thomas had always kept loaded beside the door. These weren't casual visitors or lost travelers. Everything about their bearing screamed danger. The leader, a tall man with graying hair and cold eyes, stepped onto her porch and knocked with mock politeness. "Mrs. Wade, we'd like a word with you about your husband." Sarah took a steadying breath and opened the door, keeping the shotgun visible but not directly threatening. "I'm listening." "Name's Marcus Beaumont," the man said, his smile never reaching his eyes. "I believe Jonathan mentioned me." The name hit Sarah like a physical blow. This was the man from the letter, the former employer who was supposed to be in federal custody, the one whose testimony threatened to destroy Jonathan's life. What was he doing here instead of in a Denver jail? "You're supposed to be under arrest," she said. Beaumont's laugh was genuinely amused. "Charges were dropped, Mrs. Wade. Turned out the federal prosecutors didn't have as strong a case as they thought. Amazing how things work out when you have good lawyers and friends in high places." "What do you want?" "Same thing I've always wanted, to recover what belongs to me." He gestured to his companions, who had spread out to cover the approaches to the house. "Your husband took something of considerable value when he disappeared. I'm here to collect it." Sarah's mind raced. Jonathan had told her he'd worked for Beaumont, but he'd never mentioned stealing anything. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Of course you don't." Beaumont's tone turned patronizing. "Jonathan always was protective of his women. But you see, Mrs. Wade, when he decided to retire from our partnership, he took with him certain documents that belonged to me. Documents that could be quite embarrassing if they fell into the wrong hands. What kind of documents? The kind that detail business arrangements between myself and certain government officials, contracts that might not look entirely proper to federal investigators, if you understand my meaning. Sarah was beginning to understand. Jonathan hadn't been fleeing charges of fraud or embezzlement. He'd been running from a former employer who was involved in government corruption, and he'd taken evidence of that corruption with him. Even if what you're saying is true, she said carefully, Jonathan isn't here. He left for Denver weeks ago. Oh, I know exactly where Jonathan is, Beaumont replied smoothly. He's in a federal facility outside Denver, being held for questioning about my business affairs. You see, I made sure the authorities knew where to find him. The words sent ice through Sarah's veins. You turned him in? I provided information about his location, yes. Amazing what a concerned citizen can accomplish when he puts his mind to it. Beaumont stepped closer, his presence suddenly more threatening. But Jonathan's current location isn't my immediate concern. Those documents are, and I have reason to believe he hid them here before he left. You're wrong. There's nothing here. I'm afraid I'll have to verify that for myself. Before Sarah could react, Beaumont nodded to his men. They moved with practiced efficiency, one heading for the barn while the other made for the house. Sarah raised the shotgun, but Beaumont was already close enough to grab the barrel. Now, Mrs. Wade, no need for violence. We're simply going to conduct a thorough search, and then we'll be on our way. Get off my property. I'm afraid that's not possible, you see. I have every legal right to be here. He reached into his coat and produced a folded document. Foreclosure notice. Turns out your husband's debts weren't quite as settled as he led you to believe. Amazing how quickly banks can move when the proper pressure is applied. Sarah snatched the paper from his hands, her heart sinking as she read the official language. According to the document, Jonathan had defaulted on a substantial loan, using the ranch as collateral. The bank was seizing the property, and Beaumont had purchased the debt. This is impossible. Jonathan paid off all the debts. He paid off the old debts, certainly, but he took out new ones to finance his various business ventures, loans that came due when he was arrested. Beaumont's smile was predatory. Don't look so shocked, my dear. Did you really think a man like Jonathan Wade accumulated his wealth through honest means? The betrayal hit Sarah like a physical blow. Even after his confession about his violent past, she'd believed his assurances that the ranch was safe, that she'd be provided for regardless of what happened to him. Now she was learning that everything, the security, the financial stability, even the property itself, had been built on lies. You have 24 hours to vacate the premises, Beaumont continued. My men and I will be conducting our search in the meantime. I suggest you pack only what you can carry. You can't do this. I'm afraid I can, unless of course you'd like to help us locate those documents. If you were to do that, I might be persuaded to let you stay on as a caretaker. The ranch could use someone who knows the operations. Sarah looked at this man who held her future in his hands, who was threatening to destroy everything she'd fought to preserve. The rage that had been building inside her since Jonathan's departure finally found its target. Even if I knew where these supposed documents were, she said coldly, I wouldn't tell you. Beaumont's expression hardened. That's unfortunate. For you. He turned to supervise his men's search, leaving Sarah standing on her own porch like a stranger. She watched helplessly as they ransacked the barn, the outbuildings, finally the house itself. They were thorough and destructive, overturning furniture, emptying drawers, tearing through personal belongings with casual disregard. It was in Jonathan's room that they found what they were looking for. Mr. Beaumont, one of the men called from upstairs. You need to see this. Sarah followed them up the stairs, dreading what they might have discovered. In Jonathan's room, the man was standing beside the small desk, holding what appeared to be a leather portfolio she'd never seen before. Hidden compartment in the desk drawer, the man explained. Real professional job. Beaumont took the portfolio and opened it, his eyes lighting up as he scanned the contents. Well, Jonathan always was thorough in his record-keeping. "What is it?" Sarah asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. "Evidence of every illegal transaction I've made in the past 5 years. Names, dates, amounts, even photographs of certain meetings that were supposed to be private." Beaumont looked up at her with something approaching respect. "Your husband was planning to blackmail me, Mrs. Wade. Insurance, in case I ever decided he knew too much." The revelation hit Sarah like another betrayal. Jonathan hadn't just been a hired gun. He'd been planning to use his knowledge of Beaumont's crimes for his own protection, possibly his own profit. How many lies had their marriage been built on? "Of course," Beaumont continued, tucking the portfolio inside his coat. "This changes things considerably. Now that I have what I came for, I no longer need to maintain the fiction of the foreclosure." He produced another document from his coata deed transfer, already signed and notarized. "Congratulations, Mrs. Wade. You're still the rightful owner of this ranch. My apologies for the deception, but I needed to ensure your cooperation while we conducted our search." Sarah stared at him, trying to process this latest twist. "The foreclosure was fake?" "Completely. Though I must say, your husband did leave you in a rather precarious financial position. The ranch is yours, but the operating funds he promised you were largely tied up in investments that, well, let's say they were more optimistic than practical." As quickly as they'd arrived, Beaumont and his men were gone, leaving Sarah alone in her ransacked house with the wreckage of everything she'd believed about her husband and her marriage. The truth was worse than she'd imagined. Jonathan wasn't just a man with a violent past, but someone who'd been planning to use that past for ongoing criminal enterprises. Yet as she stood in the ruins of his room, something nagged at her. The hidden compartment in the desk, the carefully preserved documents, it all seemed too convenient, too easily found. Jonathan had been methodical about everything else, but he'd left evidence of blackmail in a hiding place that any professional searcher could discover, unless he'd wanted it to be found, unless the documents were a different kind of insurance than Beaumont realized. Sarah sank into a chair, her mind reeling with possibilities. Nothing about Jonathan Wade was as simple as it seemed, and she was beginning to suspect that his final deception might be the most elaborate of all. 2 days after Beaumont's visit, Sarah was still picking up the pieces literally and figuratively. The ransacked house bore witness to the violent search, but the emotional wreckage was harder to clean up. Every broken dish, every overturned drawer, reminded her of how thoroughly she'd been deceived by the man she'd begun to trust. She was in the kitchen, sweeping up the remnants of her grandmother's china tea set, when she heard horses approaching again. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she reached for the shotgun, expecting Beaumont to return with new demands or threats. Instead, she saw a single Ridera young man in a federal marshal's uniform, his horse lathered with sweat from hard travel. "Mrs. Wade," he called from the yard, keeping his hands visible and non-threatening. "I'm Deputy Marshal Tom Brennan. I need to speak with you about your husband." Sarah stepped onto the porch, the shotgun held loosely but ready. "What about him?" "Ma'am, I'm afraid I have some difficult news. Jonathan Wade was found dead in his cell 3 days ago, apparent suicide." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. The shotgun slipped from her numb fingers, clattering on the porch boards. "Dead?" "Yes, ma'am. I'm sorry for your loss." Brennan dismounted and approached slowly, his young face grave with sympathy. "He left this for you." He handed her an envelope, sealed and marked with her name in Jonathan's familiar handwriting. Sarah stared at it, her mind struggling to process what she was hearing. Jonathan was dead. The man who'd ridden away from their ranch 6 weeks ago, promising to return if he could, would never come home. "How?" she whispered. "Hanged himself with bedsheets, according to the investigation. Left a full confession, detailing his crimes and those of his associates." Brennan's expression was carefully neutral. "Though I have to say, ma'am, there were some unusual circumstances." "What kind of circumstances?" "Well, for one thing, he managed to get word to us about Marcus Beaumont's visit here. Told us Beaumont had fake foreclosure papers and was planning to search your property for stolen documents." Sarah looked up sharply. Jonathan knew Beaumont was coming here? Apparently so. He also provided us with detailed information about Beaumont's criminal enterprises information that went far beyond what we had in our original investigation. Brennan paused, studying her face. Mrs. Wade, did your husband ever mention anything about working with federal authorities? Sarah's mind reeled. No, never. He said he was facing charges because Beaumont was testifying against him. That's what we wanted Beaumont to believe. The truth is, your husband contacted us months ago. He'd been working as an informant, gathering evidence against Beaumont and his network of corrupt officials. The revelation hit Sarah like lightning, illuminating everything in a harsh new light. Jonathan hadn't been a criminal fleeing justice. He'd been working with the law, risking his life to bring down the man who'd employed him in darker days. Those documents Beaumont found here, she said slowly, were they? Part of an elaborate setup, yes, ma'am. Your husband knew Beaumont would come looking for them eventually. The portfolio contained enough genuine information to convince Beaumont it was valuable, but it also contained evidence that would lead us directly to his other criminal associates. Brennan's respect for Jonathan was evident in his voice. Your husband spent his last weeks making sure we had everything we needed to dismantle Beaumont's entire operation. Sarah sank onto the porch steps, the weight of this new understanding threatening to overwhelm her. Then why is he dead? If he was working with you, why didn't you protect him? Brennan's expression darkened. We tried, Ma'am, but Beaumont had friends in high places, people who could arrange things even inside a federal facility. Your husband knew the risks when he agreed to help us. You're saying he was murdered? I'm saying the official cause of death was suicide, and we have no evidence to suggest otherwise. The careful wording told Sarah everything she needed to know about what the marshal really believed. She looked down at the letter in her hands, Jonathan's final words to her. With trembling fingers, she broke the seal and began to read, My dearest Sarah, if you are reading this, then my work is finished, and justice has been served, though at a cost I pray you can someday forgive. I know you must hate me for the deceptions, for the danger I brought to your door, for leaving you to face the consequences of my choices. I can only hope that someday you'll understand why I had to lie to you about so much. The truth is that I came to Sweet Creek as an agent of the federal government, tasked with gathering evidence against Marcus Beaumont and his network of corrupt officials. My reputation as a hired gun was real, but for the past 3 years, I'd been using that reputation to infiltrate criminal organizations and gather intelligence for the authorities. When I heard about your situation, it seemed like perfect cover. A remote ranch, a woman who needed help but wouldn't ask too many questions, a chance to establish a believable reason for being in the area while I completed my investigation. What I didn't expect was to fall genuinely in love with you. I know that may sound like another lie, another manipulation, but it's the truest thing I've ever written. You gave me something I'd never had a glimpse of what life could be like if I weren't always looking over my shoulder, always pretending to be someone I wasn't. For a few brief weeks, I was just Jonathan Wade, your husband, a man trying to build a life with a woman he adored. But I couldn't abandon my mission, couldn't let Beaumont and his associates continue to corrupt and steal and destroy lives. The evidence I've gathered will put them all away for a very long time, but I knew that Beaumont would never stop hunting me as long as I was alive. The only way to ensure your safety was to remove myself from the equation permanently. I've arranged for the ranch to be truly yours now, free and clear of any debts or encumbrances. The account in Denver contains enough money to keep you comfortable for the rest of your life. More importantly, you have the strength and courage to build whatever future you choose. Don't mourn for me, Sarah. Don't let my deceptions poison the good memories we made together. I was never more myself than I was with you, and if I could have chosen any life to live, it would have been the one we were building together. All my love, always. Jonathan. Tears blurred Sarah's vision as she finished reading. The man she'd thought she was losing to corruption and crime had actually sacrificed himself to serve justice. The marriage she'd believed was built on lies had been based on the deepest truth he could offer as genuine love for her. "Mrs. Wade." Marshal Brennan's voice was gentle. "Are you all right?" Sarah wiped her eyes and looked up at him. "Will Beaumont be arrested?" "He already has been. We took him into custody yesterday, along with 8 other men in his organization. Your husband's evidence was comprehensive enough to ensure they'll all spend considerable time in federal prison. And the charges against Jonathan were false from the beginning. Part of his cover. Jonathan Wade died a hero, ma'am, even if we can't say so publicly yet. His work likely prevented millions of dollars in theft and corruption." Sarah stood slowly, Jonathan's letter clutched against her chest. The man she'd married had been exactly who she'd glimpsed in their quiet moments, together honorable, brave, willing to sacrifice everything for what was right. The deceptions had been necessary armor, protection for both his mission and the woman he'd come to love. "There's one more thing," Brennan said, reaching into his saddlebag. "Your husband asked me to give you this." He handed her a small wooden box, beautifully crafted from what looked like walnut. Inside, nestled in blue velvet, was a ring knot, a wedding band, but a delicate piece set with a small diamond that caught the afternoon light like captured starfire. "He said to tell you it was the ring he would have given you if he'd been courting you properly, if he'd had the luxury of time and honesty." Brennan's voice was soft with emotion. "He said to tell you that every moment with you was worth a lifetime of loneliness." Sarah lifted the ring with shaking fingers, seeing through her tears how it caught the light, how perfectly it would fit beside Thomas's simple gold band. 2 rings, 2 loves, both lost but not forgotten. As Marshal Brennan rode away, leaving her alone with her grief and her memories, Sarah realized that Jonathan's greatest gift hadn't been the money or the security or even the brief happiness they'd shared. It had been showing her that she was strong enough to love again, brave enough to trust again, resilient enough to build a future from the ashes of loss. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded her of hope. Tomorrow, she would begin the work of rebuilding not just the physical damage from Beaumont's search, but her life itself. She had a ranch to run, a future to create, and the knowledge that she'd been loved deeply by a man who died protecting everything he held dear. It wasn't the ending she'd dreamed of, but it was an ending she could honor, and sometimes honor was enough to build a life on. 3 months passed before Sarah found the final piece of Jonathan's puzzle. Spring was returning to the Wyoming territory, bringing with it the promise of new beginnings and the annual cycle of hope that sustained ranch life. She was cleaning out the barn, preparing for the arrival of new cattle she'd purchased with Jonathan's carefully preserved funds, when her shovel struck something metallic, buried beneath the hay in the last stall. Curious, she dug deeper and uncovered a metal strongbox, locked and heavy with contents. Her heart began to race as she recognized it. This was the box Jonathan had carried in his saddlebags the day he'd first arrived at her ranch, the one she'd glimpsed but never questioned. Now, months after his death, it was finally revealing itself. The key was in the last place she thought to look, taped to the underside of Thomas's wooden cross, which still stood on the hill awaiting the permanent headstone Jonathan had promised. Her hands shook as she retrieved it, understanding finally why Jonathan had chosen that particular hiding place. He'd known she visited the grave regularly, known she would eventually find what he'd left for her. Back in the kitchen, Sarah opened the strongbox with trembling fingers. Inside, she found documents that made her gasp, not more evidence against Beaumont, but legal papers that told an entirely different story about Jonathan Wade's life and motivations. The first document was a birth certificate for Jonathan Thomas Wade, born in 1843 in Austin, Texas. The second was a marriage certificate from 1867, uniting Jonathan Wade with Elizabeth Sarah Morrison in a small church in Colorado Territory. The third was a death certificate for Elizabeth Wade, died 1869 in childbirth, along with an unnamed infant son. Sarah stared at the papers, her mind reeling. Elizabeth Sarah. The same name as herself, the same name as his beloved wife who had died 20 years ago. Had his interest in her been based purely on that coincidence, or was there something deeper at work? The answer came in the form of a daguerreotype wrapped carefully in silk wedding portrait of Jonathan and his first wife. Sarah nearly dropped the photograph when she saw Elizabeth's face. The resemblance wasn't exact, but it was unmistakable. They shared the same delicate features, the same dark hair, the same determined set to their chin. Looking at Elizabeth Wade was like looking into a mirror that reflected not just physical similarity, but something deeper, a kindred spirit, perhaps, or simply the type of woman who attracted a man like Jonathan. Beneath the photograph was a letter, dated 2 days before Jonathan's death, written in his careful script. My beloved Sarah, if you are reading this, then you have discovered the final truth about my deceptions, and I pray you will find it in your heart to forgive me for one last lie. I did not come to Sweet Creek as part of a federal investigation, though I was indeed working with the marshals to bring down Beaumont. I came because I learned that a woman named Sarah, a widow struggling to save her husband's ranch, was in desperate need of help. When I heard your story, I felt as though fate was offering me a chance at redemption. You see, I failed Elizabeth. I was away on business when she went into labor, pursuing the very criminal enterprises that would eventually lead me to work for the government as penance for my past. She died alone, calling for a husband who wasn't there, and I have carried that guilt for 20 years. When I learned about your situation, I saw an opportunity to do for you what I couldn't do for her to be present, to provide protection and security, to ensure that a good woman wouldn't suffer for circumstances beyond her control. I told myself it was justice, a way of balancing the scales for my past failures. But from the moment I saw you standing on your porch, so brave in the face of impossible odds, I knew I was deceiving myself. You weren't Elizabeth, and this wasn't about redemption. This was about a lonely man who had found someone worth living for, worth dying for, worth loving with everything he had left to give. The physical resemblance between you and Elizabeth is real, but it's not why I stayed. I stayed because you showed me kindness when I was a stranger, trust when I'd given you little reason for it, and hope for a future I'd thought was impossible. You are your own woman, Sarah, strong and brave and beautiful in ways that have nothing to do with anyone who came before you. I hope that knowing the truth won't diminish what we had together. What I felt for you was real, separate from my past, untainted by grief or guilt or the need for redemption. You gave me the greatest gift a man can receive, the chance to love and be loved in return, however briefly. The money is yours, the ranch is yours, the future is yours, to build as you see fit. You owe nothing to my memory, nothing to Elizabeth's ghost, nothing to anyone but yourself. Live fully. Love again if you find someone worthy of your heart, and know that somewhere, 2 people who loved you are grateful that you chose to keep going when it would have been easier to give up. With all my love and gratitude, Jonathan. Sarah sat in the growing darkness of her kitchen, surrounded by the remnants of 3 Liveshires, Thomases, and Jonathan's soul woven together by threads of love and loss, and the relentless human need to connect with another soul. The revelation of Elizabeth's existence should have felt like betrayal, another deception to add to the growing list. Instead, it felt like completion, the final piece that made sense of Jonathan's careful attention, his patient courtship, his willingness to die rather than bring danger to her door. He had loved 2 women named Sarah, both lost to him through circumstances beyond his control. But the love itself had been real, separate and distinct, valued for what it was rather than what it reminded him of. As she held Elizabeth's photograph, Sarah realized she wasn't angry. She was grateful that Jonathan had found a second chance at happiness, grateful that she had been able to give him peace in his final months, grateful that love could survive even the most complicated circumstances and still remain pure at its core. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions about how to move forward with the knowledge she now possessed. But tonight, She would honor all the love that had shaped her life, Thomas's steadfast devotion, Jonathan's passionate sacrifice, and her own capacity to give and receive love despite repeated losses. The story wasn't over. It was simply ready for its next chapter. The knock on her door came at sunset, exactly 1 year after Jonathan had first ridden into her life. Sarah had been expecting it, though she couldn't have said why. Some intuition, perhaps, or simply the way significant moments seemed to echo across time, creating patterns that felt like destiny. She opened the door to find a woman standing on her porch, tall, elegant, with silver-streaked hair, and the kind of refined bearing that spoke of education and privilege. But it was her eyes that made Sarah's breath catch. They were Jonathan's eyes, the same deep brown, the same patient kindness touched with old sorrow. "Mrs. Wade," the woman said, her voice cultured and soft. "My name is Catherine Morrison. I believe you knew my brother." Sarah's mind reeled. Brother? Jonathan had never mentioned a sister, but then again, there had been so many things he'd never mentioned. She stepped back, gesturing for the woman to enter. "Please, come in. I'll make coffee." They sat across from each other at the kitchen table where Sarah had shared so many meals with Jonathan, where she'd first read the letter that had started this entire journey. Catherine Morrison was studying the room with eyes that seemed to catalogue every detail, as if she were looking for traces of the brother she'd lost. "I heard about Jonathan's death from the federal marshals," Catherine said quietly. "They told me what he'd done, how he'd helped them bring down Beaumont's organization. I came as soon as I could arrange the travel from San Francisco." "He never mentioned you," Sarah said, not unkindly. "No, I imagine he wouldn't have. We'd been estranged for years, ever since Elizabeth's death. I blamed him for not being there when she needed him, and he blamed himself enough for both of us." Catherine's smile was sad but peaceful. "It took losing him permanently to realize how foolish our pride had been." Sarah poured coffee with steady hands, though her mind was racing with questions. "You knew Elizabeth? She was my dearest friend, like a sister to me long before she married my brother. When she died, I lost them both her to death, him to guilt and the dangerous life he chose afterward." Catherine accepted the coffee gratefully. "Mrs. Wade, may I ask you something?" "Of course." "Did he love you? I mean truly love you, not just as a substitute for Elizabeth?" The question was direct, painful, and exactly what Sarah needed to hear. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "He loved me, and I loved him, despite everything." Catherine's shoulders sagged with relief. "I'm so glad. Elizabeth would have wanted that for him, would have wanted him to find happiness again, to have a chance at the family he'd lost. The marshals said he died a hero, but that doesn't make the loss any easier." "No, it doesn't." Catherine reached into her reticule and withdrew a small package wrapped in brown paper. "I brought you something that belonged to him. Something I thought you should have." Sarah unwrapped the package carefully, revealing a leather-bound bookknot, a journal like the one Jonathan had carried, but something older, more personal. The cover was worn smooth by countless handlings, and when she opened it, she found page after page of sketches in Jonathan's precise style. The first drawings were of a young woman, Elizabeth, Sarah realized, captured in dozens of small moments. Elizabeth reading by a window, Elizabeth laughing at something beyond the frame of the sketch, Elizabeth sleeping peacefully in what must have been their marriage bed. The love in each line was evident, the careful attention to detail that spoke of a man memorizing every aspect of the woman he adored. But as Sarah turned the pages, the sketches changed. Gradually, Elizabeth's features gave way to another woman's face, her own. Here was Sarah hanging laundry in the morning sun, Sarah standing at the stove preparing dinner, Sarah sitting on the porch at sunset, with her face turned toward the mountains. The style was the same, the careful attention identical, but the subject had changed. The final sketch took her breath away. It was herself and Jonathan together, sitting at this very table, her hand resting on his, as they shared some moment of quiet intimacy. She didn't remember the specific moment, but she could see from the drawing that it had meant everything to him, this simple gesture of affection, this evidence that he'd found love again, despite his past. "He drew this while you were here?" Catherine asked, looking over Sarah's shoulder. "Yes. I had no idea." Sarah touched the paper gently, imagining Jonathan working by lamplight, capturing these moments he wanted to preserve forever. "That's Jonathan for you. Always watching, always remembering, always trying to hold on to the good things in life." Catherine was quiet for a moment. "Mrs. Wade, Sarah, I want you to know that I'm grateful to you. You gave my brother something I couldn't: forgiveness, peace, a chance to be happy again." The Jonathan who drew these pictures was the man he used to be before grief and guilt changed him. Sarah closed the sketchbook carefully, understanding that she was holding something precious, not just artwork, but evidence of a transformation. The man who had come to her ranch as a federal agent and hired gun had left it as someone capable of love again. Someone who had found redemption, not through penance, but through the simple act of opening his heart to another person. "What will you do now?" Catherine asked. Sarah looked around her kitchen, her home, the life she'd built from loss and love and sheer stubborn determination. "I'll keep going," she said simply. That's what he would have wanted. That's what they both would have wanted. Outside, the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in the colors of hope and new beginnings. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own possibilities. But tonight, Sarah Wade sat with her husband's sister and finally understood the full truth of what she'd shared with Jonathan. Not a pale echo of his first love, but something entirely new and equally precious. Love, she realized, didn't diminish when it was divided. It multiplied, creating connections that could span lifetimes and link hearts across impossible distances. Thomas, Jonathan, Elizabeth, Catherine, herself, they were all part of a story larger than any individual tragedy or triumph. And the story, Sarah knew, was far from over. 5 years later, Sarah stood on the hill overlooking her ranch, watching the sun set behind mountains that had witnessed so much joy and sorrow, so many endings and beginnings. The permanent headstone she'd commissioned finally stood where Thomas's wooden cross had weathered for so long, a beautiful piece of granite that incorporated his original carving into its design, just as Jonathan had promised. Beside it, a second stone bore Jonathan's name and the dates of his life, along with the simple inscription he'd requested in one of his final letters. He found his way home. The federal government had eventually allowed his remains to be moved here, recognizing his service and sacrifice in bringing down one of the territory's most dangerous criminal networks. 2 graves, 2 loves, 2 chapters of a life that had been shaped by loss but defined by resilience. Sarah visited them both regularly, bringing wildflowers in summer and evergreen boughs in winter, sharing news of the ranch and the life she continued to build on the foundation they'd helped create. The ranch itself had prospered beyond anything she could have imagined during those desperate months when foreclosure had seemed inevitable. Jonathan's money had provided the seed capital, but Sarah's determination and growing business acumen had turned the modest operation into one of the most successful in the territory. She now ran 300 head of cattle, employed 6 full-time hands, and had recently purchased the adjacent property to expand her grazing land. But the ranch's success wasn't just measured in cattle and acreage. It had become something of a sanctuary for people who needed a second chance: widows seeking work, drifters looking for honest employment, families displaced by hard times or harder men. Sarah had learned from Jonathan's example that sometimes the most important investment you could make was in human dignity. "Mrs. Wade." Sarah turned to find Jake Morrison approaching, his hat in his hands and his expression carefully respectful. Jake had been one of her first employees after Jonathan's death, working his way up from general hand to ranch foreman through steady reliability and quiet competence. He was a good man, kind and honest, with a sort of dependable strength that reminded her of Thomas. "The new herd is settled in the south pasture," he reported. "Doc Patterson says their healthy stock should do well through the winter." "Thank you, Jake. You've done good work with them." He nodded, then hesitated as if he wanted to say more. Over the past year, Sarah had become aware of Jake's growing attention to her, not presumptuous or demanding, but quietly hopeful. He was younger than she by several years, unmarried, with the patience to wait for whatever encouragement she might eventually offer. "Sarah," he said, using her first name for the first time, "I was wondering if you might consider having dinner with me sometime. Not business," he added quickly. "Just dinner." Sarah studied his face, seeing the vulnerability beneath his careful composure. He was a good man, deserving of more than the polite distance she'd maintained since Jonathan's death. But the idea of opening her heart again, of risking the pain that seemed to follow love as surely as shadow followed light, still frightened her. "Jake," she said gently, "I'm honored by your interest, truly, but I need you to understand that I may never be ready for what you're hoping for." "I understand that, Mum, but I also think 5 years is long enough for any woman to mourn alone, especially one who has so much life left to live." His words echoed something Jonathan had written in one of his letters, that she shouldn't spend her life mourning, that she deserved happiness and love and all the messy complications of sharing a life with another person. Perhaps it was time to stop hiding behind grief and start embracing the possibility of joy. "All right," she said, surprising them both. "Dinner. But Jake eats just dinner. I can't promise anything more than that." His smile was radiant. Just dinner is more than enough to start with. As they walked back down the hill toward the ranch house, Sarah found herself thinking about the different kinds of love she'd experienced. Thomas had been her first love, passionate and all-consuming, the kind of connection that defined youth and shaped dreams. Jonathan had been something deeper, more complex love tempered by loss, seasoned by experience, built on mutual respect and shared understanding of life's harsh realities. What she might find with Jake, if she found anything at all, would be different again. Calmer perhaps, less desperate, built on friendship and shared goals rather than rescue or redemption. It wouldn't diminish what she'd had with Thomas or Jonathan, but it might add a new chapter to her story. The house looked welcoming in the gathering twilight, its windows glowing with lamplight and the promise of warmth. Catherine Morrison visited twice a year now, staying for weeks at a time and becoming the sister Sarah had never had. There were letters from friends in town, business associates from Denver, even a few distant relatives who had reconnected after learning of her prosperity. The loneliness that had once threatened to consume her had been replaced by a full, if complicated, life. She had work that challenged her, financial security beyond her wildest dreams, and a community of people who respected and cared for her. She had memories of great love and loss, and the growing possibility that both might visit her again. In the kitchen, where so much of her story had unfolded, where she'd first read the foreclosure notice that had started it all, where she'd accepted Jonathan's impossible proposal, where she'd learned the truth about his death and the depth of his love, Sarah began preparing dinner for two. It wasn't the grand gesture that had characterized her previous relationships, but it was a beginning. As she worked, she thought about the words Jonathan had written in his final letter: "Live fully, love again if you find someone worthy of your heart." Perhaps Jake Morrison was that someone, or perhaps he was simply the bridge to whatever came next. Either way, she was finally ready to find out. The sun disappeared behind the mountains, leaving the sky painted in shades of purple and gold. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new possibilities, as all tomorrows did. But tonight, Sarah Wade would share a meal with a good man and see where conversation led them. It wasn't the ending she'd once imagined for her story, but it was an ending she could embrace with hope. After all, the best stories never really ended. They just began again, chapter by chapter, with each choice to keep living, keep loving, keep believing in the possibility of joy.